At 62, most people around her believed her life story was already written. They thought her best years were behind her. They thought her voice was too old to matter. They thought she would stay silent, like everyone else before her. Her name was Margaret Hale. She lived in a quiet town in the Midwest, a town built around one powerful corporation that provided jobs, funded schools, and sponsored local events. The company logo was everywhere, on buildings, on billboards, on Little League uniforms. Margaret had worked for this company for 37 years. She started when she was 25. She worked her way up slowly, honestly, and patiently. She believed in loyalty. She believed in fairness. She believed that hard work protected people. For decades, she handled internal records, invoices, compliance files, audit support. She was known as reliable, invisible, someone who never caused trouble. At 61, she planned her retirement. She dreamed of gardening, spending time with her grandchildren, living quietly. Then, one late evening, everything changed. While reviewing archived financial files for a routine internal request, Margaret noticed something that did not make sense. Numbers that did not align, payments that appeared twice, vendor names that did not exist before. At first, she assumed it was a simple mistake. She had seen errors before, but something about this felt deliberate. She stayed late that night, then later the next. She compared years of data. Patterns began to appear. Millions of dollars, quietly redirected, hidden under complex internal transfers. Funds meant for safety upgrades, funds meant for employee pensions. Her hands shook as she realized what she was seeing. This was not a mistake. This was fraud. Margaret faced a terrifying truth. If she was right, then the company that supported her town, the company trusted by thousands, was lying. She could ignore it, retire peacefully. No one would blame her. But Margaret could not sleep. She remembered coworkers injured because safety improvements were delayed. She remembered younger employees laid off while executives received bonuses. She remembered believing the company was struggling when it was not. At 62, Margaret understood something clearly. Silence would make her part of the lie. The next morning, she requested a meeting with her supervisor. He laughed gently, told her not to worry, told her these matters were above her pay grade. That was the moment Margaret realized no one wanted the truth. From that day forward, her life would never be the same. After that meeting, Margaret felt a quiet shift around her. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Emails went unanswered. Her workload was suddenly reduced. It was as if the company wanted her to disappear without saying it out loud. Margaret was not a woman who enjoyed conflict. She had spent her entire life avoiding it. But now, conflict had found her. She began documenting everything, every altered file, every missing record, every transaction that no longer appeared where it once had. She printed copies, saved backups, stored them in places no one would think to look. At home, her daughter noticed the change. Margaret slept less, ate less, spoke carefully. When her family learned what she had discovered, fear filled the room. They begged her to stop. They reminded her of her age, her health, her retirement. They reminded her of the power of the company. But Margaret felt something stronger than fear. She felt responsibility. The pressure increased. A formal warning appeared in her file accusing her of poor performance, a performance record that had been spotless for decades. She was moved to a smaller office without explanation. One afternoon, a senior executive called her in. He spoke softly, smiled politely, then warned her that continuing to ask questions could damage her reputation. Margaret walked out shaking, not from weakness, but from anger. She contacted internal compliance. No response. She contacted human resources. They advised her to focus on her remaining months of work. That night, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by papers, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering how far the company would go. She searched for answers quietly, late at night. She read about whistleblower protections, about people who lost everything, about people who never recovered. At 62, starting over felt impossible. Then, one email arrived, anonymous, short. It said, "You are not wrong. Be careful." Margaret realized someone else inside the company knew, and that meant the fraud was bigger than she imagined. The next week, security revoked her access to several databases. No explanation, no warning. Margaret understood the message. Stop digging. Instead, she dug deeper. She contacted an independent investigator through a secure channel. She shared a small sample of what she had found, enough to prove her claims. The investigator replied with words that changed everything. "This is serious. This could impact thousands." Margaret stared at the screen, her heart racing. She knew once she crossed this line, there was no going back. And she crossed it. Once Margaret shared her evidence with the independent investigator, she knew her life was about to change forever. The next day, she was called into the office again. This time, the atmosphere was colder. No smiles, no small talk. The company had discovered she had shared internal documents. Her access was permanently revoked. She was told she would be put on paid leave pending investigation. But everyone knew what that really meant. Her job was over. Margaret went home that evening, sat at her kitchen table, fingers hovering over the phone, unsure if she should call her lawyer yet. She knew the risk. She also knew she could not stay silent. Margaret filed a formal whistleblower complaint. The process was slow, intimidating, exhausting. Executives denied everything, claimed she had misinterpreted records, claimed she had personal grievances. The town she had lived in for decades began to change its tone toward her. Neighbors whispered, friends avoided her, even longtime colleagues seemed distant. Margaret received anonymous letters in her mailbox, warnings, threats, messages telling her to give up before it was too late. Her family begged her to stop. Her daughter cried. Her husband held her hand but admitted he was terrified for her safety. Margaret understood the fear. She felt it too, but she could not turn back. She began speaking with journalists, carefully, with caution. She knew exposure could protect her, but it could also destroy her. Weeks passed, then months. The media slowly started picking up the story. Local newspapers, then national outlets. Questions were raised. Investigations were launched. Margaret's courage inspired others inside the company. Employees began coming forward quietly, providing corroborating evidence. Her fear began to transform into hope. She lost her job. Her reputation in some circles was questioned. Her friends were tested. But Margaret realized something important. Her truth was louder than their silence. Even at 62, even under pressure, even facing threats in isolation, Margaret had taken the first step, and it was the most powerful step she had ever taken in her life. The fight was far from over, but Margaret now knew she was not alone. As the investigation grew bigger, Margaret's world became a whirlwind. Lawyers called constantly. Reporters emailed relentlessly. Her phone rang at odd hours. Sometimes she ignored it. Sometimes she answered with a calm she did not feel. The company tried everything to silence her. Threats of lawsuits, offers of hush money, promises of pensions if she stayed quiet. They even tried to discredit her publicly, calling her confused, overly emotional, claiming she misunderstood complex finances. Margaret refused. She refused quietly, but firmly. She remembered the employees injured by unsafe practices. She remembered families affected by pension mismanagement. She remembered the promise she had made to herself to do the right thing. Her courage began to gain attention. Local news picked up her story, then national media followed. Interviews were scheduled. Margaret spoke carefully. She told the truth, nothing more, nothing less. People began calling her a hero. Strangers sent letters. Some traveled to meet her. Some shared their own stories of injustice. Margaret realized her single act of courage was inspiring hundreds, if not thousands. Meanwhile, the company's lawyers intensified their tactics. They delayed court hearings. They challenged every document. They attempted to discredit every witness. But Margaret had prepared. She had backups. She had dates. She had proof. Court dates arrived. Margaret sat in the front row. Her hands sometimes shook. Her heart sometimes raced, but her eyes were steady. Her voice was calm. Each testimony brought a new revelation. Each evidence shown added pressure on the executives. Months turned into a year. The legal battle tested Margaret's strength, her family's patience, and her own resolve. Through it all, Margaret never wavered. She worked closely with investigators, she supported other whistleblowers, she faced sleepless nights, threats, questions, and still, she persisted. Finally, one morning, the headlines appeared. The fraud had been proven, executives were held accountable, restitution was ordered. The town that had doubted her began to cheer. Margaret's courage was now part of the public record. Even at 63, Margaret understood the magnitude of what she had done. She had challenged power, she had risked everything, she had not only exposed the truth, she had created hope. After the court ruling, Margaret's life changed forever. The company that had tried to silence her was now under strict oversight. Executives were removed, policies were rewritten, employees received the benefits and safety improvements they had been promised for years. Margaret returned to her quiet town. She no longer worked for the corporation. She no longer worried about hiding her voice. She spent mornings in her garden, afternoons with her grandchildren, evenings writing her story down for others to read. But she also became something she never expected: a symbol, a mentor, a voice for those who had been ignored. She received invitations to speak at conferences, at universities, at nonprofit gatherings. She shared lessons about courage, about integrity, about never being too old to make a difference. People would approach her in streets. Some thanked her for inspiring them. Some shared their own struggles of injustice. Margaret realized her fight was bigger than a single company. It was about every person who had been silenced, every person who had been told they were too old, every person who had been told their voice did not matter. She understood that courage does not have an age, that impact is not measured by titles or power, that integrity sometimes means standing alone, and that even a 62-year-old woman can change the world. Margaret spent her remaining years helping whistleblowers, advising organizations on ethics, mentoring younger professionals, writing articles, giving interviews. She became a reminder that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who everyone assumes will stay silent, can be the most powerful voices of all. Her story spread across the nation, featured in magazines, shared online, used in schools as an example of integrity and bravery. Margaret never sought fame. She only wanted justice, and in doing so, she inspired a generation to never underestimate the courage of a single, determined woman. At 65, Margaret finally felt peace. Not because the battle was easy, not because she had no fear, but because she knew she had done what mattered most. She had spoken the truth, she had risked everything, and she had changed the world.